Well, we've been watching this globalist attack on our food supply, on our farmers, and our way of life. And this weekend, massive protests all over Europe against sanctions in Russia. And then, of course, the big story in the Netherlands, over 3,000 farms basically being shut down, taken over because of EU nitrogen regulations, driving these farmers out of business and destroying their way of life. Massive protests and all of this. And a person who's been watching the story very closely is our friend, academic researcher Ralph Schoelhammer, who joins us back here again on the show. Ralph, great to see you. I mean, first, just your reaction, seeing all of these farmers standing up to the police, being dragged away, being thrown in black vans by the police. This is happening in a Western democracy?
Well, the only good news I can tell so far is this. I looked at the most recent polls out of the Netherlands, and it seems that voters tend to be more and more sympathetic towards the farmer citizens movement, which is kind of the political arm of the Dutch farmers, and also Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom. So when there will be, and hopefully sooner rather than later, new elections in the Netherlands, I hope that the sympathy that is currently there will also then translate into a success at the voting booth, because you're absolutely right. I mean, it is absurd. I mean, we watch currently European leaders at least sometimes speak out against what's going on in China's zero COVID policy, but we do exactly the same just in another area, right? Whether it's truckers in Canada or farmers in the Netherlands, looks almost like we take the playbook from the Chinese and we are like shocked when they do it, but we have no problems doing it ourselves. So I think it's really time to take a look into the mirror and do something against this.
I don't know if these globalists realize, I mean, they are destroying our way of life. And when you have no food, this is a staple. This isn't like we're talking about you're just kicking back and you're taking away someone's PlayStation. You're literally taking away the staples. You're taking away food. You're taking away energy. This is when we see us a return to the dark ages. And I don't mean to be alarmist about it. There's no putting this genie back in the bottle, because you can't just rewild, a hillside and decide that, there's going to be food supplies. You're going to turn this back into a forest and it's going to be fine. And people could just go out and find berries and pick lettuce. You can't do that. The cultivated farms, thanks to fossil fuels and thanks to our energy structure, have given us this way of life. And this could really, really set us back decades.
No, I think you're right. And I think you hit the nail on the head. We have to call this what it is. This is a war against the pillars of civilization in many ways, right? Whether it's in the realm of energy against fossil fuels and against nuclear, or whether it's against nitrogen and then by extension against synthetic fertilizers, which are of course crucial to feed not just people in Europe, but to feed people around the world. I mean, we all saw and remember what happened in Sri Lanka. So this is, and you mentioned the Middle Ages. I don't think you're that far off. We very often tend to look at these movements in a way like as neo-Marxists or something, but I think they're much more like a neo-Puritan movement, where the idea is what you said the PlayStation, don't worry, they're going to come for your PlayStation too. But where really the idea is, right, that we need to cleanse ourselves of the past, like that the society needs to shed itself of the luxuries of the past in order to become born again. And you see this also in the way they talk, whether it's at the WF and all these institutions. There is this significant religious undertone. And I think this is really how we have to tackle this problem. This is not about the environment. It's not about the climate. It's about the kind of quasi-religious reawakening that uses the matter of climate, that uses the matter of the environment as their, kind of symbols of religious sentiment. But it really is not that different.
I think you're absolutely right about this. I think it's not about the climate, because if you read Alex Epstein's book, if you read Michael Schellenberger's work, if you read Bjorn Lundberg's work, if you study what you talk about and write about, it's not about the environment. So then what is this? What is the agenda then for these globalists if it's not about actually CO2 reduction? It's something much bigger then.
No, I think it really is this idea. I mean, Klaus Schwab, his book is literally called The Great Reset, right? And the question is, so what is that reset supposed to be about? And they do talk about this, like a new age of humanity. We're going to usher into a new period. It's exactly how, the reformists, the Puritans, how religious kind of millennial movements are talking, right? That something new must come. And in order to get there, we have to destroy all the old. So it doesn't matter if it's nitrogen. It doesn't matter if it's nuclear. It doesn't matter whatever solution we would come up with, they would reject the solution because there's almost a desire to bring on, if you want, the end times. I mean, there is a very popular book currently in Germany written by a journalist, and it's very high up in the bestseller list at the moment, that makes the argument we need to degrow back to the 1970s. So kind of living standards in the 1970s were good enough. Based on what she's actually proposing, we're going to end up in the 1870s, but that's where the journey is supposed to be going. And the most important thing is always keep in mind, it's going to be you and me who are going to be thrown back into the 1970s. It's not going to be Klaus Schwab and those others, right? Because they, of course, since they are the let's say, the high priests of this new movement, they then have certain privileges that others don't have, right? Because they still have to travel, right? They still have, they need to have access to, all kinds of technology and energy because they are so important in this new movement. But everybody else, of course, has to cut back.
So these nitrogen standards in the Netherlands are ridiculous. Of course, we know that was the case. We knew that these farmers wouldn't be able to live up to this given the timeline that they had to adhere to this plan. Given some more time, the great resiliency of the human race is that if we had enough time to catch up to this, to revise the way that we farm, a lot of these farmers in a short amount of time invested in new equipment just to try to keep up with these new nitrogen standards. And they spent a lot of their own money to try to get there. And it's all for nothing now. They're just having, it's all money down it really is upsetting. I mean, all of this money just flushed down the toilet and they're taking their farms anyway.
No, I think there's also a moral dimension because the argument from the Dutch government is, well, we're going to pay those farmers over market price. So what are they complaining about? But imagine you own a farm that has been within your family for generations. Or as you just said, you put your heart and soul into this business, into your farm, into your agricultural work. And then the government comes along and says, here you go, there is a one-time payment and now we close everything down. So this is also from a moral perspective, I think something that should not be accepted. And if they can do it in this area, of course, they can do it anywhere else as well. And it has to be clear, everything is always a trade-off. Of course, I mean, agriculture has effects on the environment. Nobody denies that. And as you mentioned, neither did the Dutch farmers. But as they correctly point out, every transition, every innovation takes time to kind of then show its full positive effect. So I'm absolutely sure that the Dutch farmers will solve this problem. But there is, again, this millennial element, this cultish element that says, if we don't do it now, the world is going to end tomorrow. Of course, the world is not going to end tomorrow. It's also not going to end the day after tomorrow. It's like we have decades to deal with this problem. And most importantly, also what you mentioned, at some point, people will no longer go along because now the idea is, we just pump more money into the system, what central banks are doing, what governments are doing. We kind of try to paper over all these consequences, higher food prices, right? Higher costs of living. But at some point, printing money will not be as fast as the rise in prices. And then people will say, well, 2 years ago, I had to spend, 20% of my income on food and housing. Now it's 40%. Next year, it's going to be 50%. So at some point, they're going to say, I'm no longer going to go along with this. And I think kind of our obligation is almost to say, we should act against this now and not when it's too late or when this process has already started.
I want to pivot a little bit and talk about nuclear. You and I are both big fans of nuclear. There's an insanity that's been sweeping the globe over the past couple of years, of course, anti-nuclear stances, and really just the covering up of the data, the truth about nuclear power. And there's something really interesting happening with uranium right now and our lack of uranium in the Western world. I mean, the United States is producing zero uranium, and Europe relies on Russia to get their uranium, and Kazakhstan. So does the United States. And so they're putting this $60 price cap on oil from Russia. Ursula von der Leyen has talked about, great, we're moving from 40% now down to 9% of our energy coming from Russia through pipelines, et cetera. We're getting now our stuff from the United States. But this nuclear delusion continues to unfold. And in Germany specifically, of course, in the next few months, those power plants are going to be shut down. At the same time, Japan is now turning their power plants back on, home of Fukushima, for crying out loud. So can you talk a little bit about the nuclear delusion and where is Europe going to get its uranium if Putin says, we're done? We're not sending you any more uranium with all of the shenanigans that you've been pulling over oil and gas. Like, we're done. Now you've got to go find your own uranium to try to actually get these power plants back up and running. They're going to be screwed.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of points, because you called it, I think, justifiably the nuclear delusion. And to give you one example, the European Union is currently planning to fine the French 500 million euros because they didn't build enough renewables. But we're talking about the same France that has significantly reduced emissions via electricity production because they have so much nuclear. But the EU doesn't care that emissions are low. They just look at how many renewables did they build. So even if we would build nuclear and get emissions down, they still wouldn't be satisfied. So it's the same story with the farmers in the Netherlands, just in the area of nuclear. The uranium question is a good one because it's the same with natural gas and oil. Europe would have uranium, but of course we cannot mine it because environmental conditions, right? Environmental restrictions and regulations. And the other point is, if you look at Germany at the moment, I mean, if it wouldn't be so sad, it would be hilarious. Currently, while we are talking, Germany's electricity production is one of the dirtiest in the world. It's dirtier than India, it's dirtier than South Africa. They're like number 170 out of 177 nations when it comes to CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour produced. Because there is not a lot of wind and not a lot of sun at the moment. So where do they get electricity from? They get it from burning coal and they get it from burning gas, which is, of course, significantly more CO2 intensive. And they still insist on saying, no, we're going to close down nuclear. It makes no difference. Over the last 30 days, 4 gigawatt of installed nuclear has produced more electricity than 300 gigawatt of installed renewables. Because if there is no sun, if there is no wind, it doesn't matter how many photovoltaic and solar farms you have, and it doesn't matter how many wind turbines you put up. They are not moving. They are not doing anything. So it's exactly the same thing, just in another area than we have with the Dutch farmers. Right? It's a form of cognitive dissonance, right? You double down on a policy where, if you look at it objectively and sober, you know this is not going to work. So, but they still want to do just more of it. It's a very odd, and this is why I always say a religious, cult-like behavior than it is a hard-nosed scientific approach.
My guest is Ralph Schoelhammer, one of the keenest intellects on this subject, and we love having him on the show. Thank you so much for all of your thoughts on this. I hope you have a wonderful holiday with the family as well, Ralph. Thank you so much for joining us.
Same to you, Clay. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I love Ralph, and I love, by the way, that Ralph has Masters of the Universe figures behind him in his studio, which just warms the cockles of my heart. He talked about the PlayStation. Well, we talked about the PlayStation in that interview, and the thing that stands out to me is, no, they want you to have they want to be able to use that for psyops. Like, this is where they're actively looking for new people that know how to play video games and Call of Duty so that they can recruit those individuals. We saw the psyops stories. So they're probably fine with you keeping that, but they're going to take away everything else. Really, really troubling. I mean, I don't know what they're planning.
Not to mention the opiate of the masses, like with the whole, was that Marx that said that television was the opiate of the masses? So
yeah.
You got to have your PlayStation, otherwise we'll revolt.
We need to wake up, folks. I mean, it's they want it. They want to keep making sure that you have as many sedatives as possible. They want to make sure that you're just sedate, that you have your Netflix.
Well, and also one of the most popular games on the PlayStation is that Call of Duty, which just justifies war and makes it look cool.
Yeah. Well, and we now know that it's a psyops. Like, we know that we know that they've actively been working with the game developers on this, because and in fact, I don't know if you saw the story this past week where the FBI is actually studying those who in these games and the online who actually are playing these games, going after people and like targeting. They're like, oh, that person has a violent tendency, so we're going to watch them, kind of like a Minority Report. Oh, they're really violent in this video game. They must be violent in real life, so we're going to watch
drone
them.
Pilots.
Yes.
From those video games.
Yeah. So the drones that were just hitting inside of Russia today, where do you think those were piloted from? Call of Duty fingers. Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at Redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to Redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.